Welcome to Our Appalachia. My name is Phil Conn. I'm your host, and we're going to talk about an aspect of our history and our culture today. We have as our guest Dr. Gordon McKinney from Cullowhee, North Carolina. Now, Dr. McKinney is here on the campus of Morehead State University, having given an outstanding lecture last night. And last night he talked to us about the political traditions in eastern Kentucky. But today we're going to shift a little, and we're going to talk about the role of the federal government in the Southern Mountain region. Let me give you a little information, though, on Dr. McKinney. He is an outstanding scholar in the whole realm of political issues with regard to the Southern Mountains. He got interested in the topic of politics in the mountains when he was a doctoral student at Northwestern University in Chicago. And he did a doctoral dissertation on mountain republicanism, ended up doing an outstanding book on that topic. So he decided he might as well live in the midst of all of this interesting information. He came to Western Carolina University in Cullowhee and is a professor of history there. Welcome to our campus, Dr. McKinney.
Thank you, Phil.
This topic is of great interest to most of us. We know something about the federal role in Appalachia. We know of contemporary programs like the Appalachian Regional Commission or the programs that existed during the War on Poverty. But since we have a historian, I think it's going to be exciting to go all the way back and to study not only the federal view of the Southern Mountains, the attitudes in Washington and among national statesmen toward the Appalachian South, but conversely, the attitudes that mountaineers have had toward the federal government. Was it an attitude of support and respect, or one of begrudging respect, or one of downright animosity? So I guess if we're going to talk about the relationship between the Southern Mountains and the federal government, we ought to go all the way back to the Declaration of Independence and events that followed shortly thereafter. And let me just ask you, obviously there wasn't a great deal of settlement in the Southern Mountains in the 18th century, but what was the role of the Southern Mountains, if any, during the Revolutionary War?
The Southern Mountain people, first of all, did some fighting. They fought at Kings Mountain, Battle of Kings Mountain on the border between North Carolina and South Carolina. They were part of the George Rogers Clark expedition to Illinois that won several important battles on the frontier. They were, for the most part, quite patriotic. Mm-hmm. This nation was divided. In a sense, the Revolutionary War was our first civil war.
Right.
And I can say that with some feeling because most of my relatives live in Canada, where they went because they were loyal to King George.
I see.
The policy of the British toward the Indians was very important in the American Revolution. In North Carolina, where I now live, the British supported the Cherokees, and the new American government supported the pioneers against the Cherokees. Mm-hmm. And the American government attitude was, generally speaking, to support the pioneers against the Cherokees. Many mountain people felt that if the British won the war, they would favor the Indians. And the result was that most pioneers in the mountains were very favorably disposed at first toward the federal government. And so the federal government and the mountain people started off their relationship with a very positive feeling toward each other.
Right. But now, would you say that Southern Mountain people were really fighting against the British as bona fide revolutionaries, people wanting independence? Or was some of this merely strife between the established Tories, I guess some of them were, in the lowlands?
There was some of that. This would be particularly true in Kentucky and in what is today, well, actually in Tennessee as well. The reason being that both of those areas were the frontier regions of major colonies. Mm-hmm. This was frontier Virginia. Tennessee was frontier North Carolina. Mm-hmm. They weren't represented in the colonial assemblies very well. There were some great adventures where people were captured and taken back to the mother colonies and kept in jail. We have the state of Franklin that is created after the war, or just at the end of the war in Tennessee. And so while there is a generally good feeling toward the federal government, there is not a good feeling toward lowland governments. Now, these are lowland governments in what are today other states,
right.
But there's already hostility.
Right. There were then some bona fide Appalachian Revolutionary War heroes. This is not the figment of imagination of some Appalachian zealot.
No, absolutely not.
Okay. Now, I guess a lot of the settlement in Appalachia came as a result of land grants subsequent to the Revolutionary War. Is that correct?
That is correct. Veterans of the war, depending on their military rank, were given land grants by the states quite often, and also by the federal government. And most of the land that was available in many states was the unsettled mountain region. And in North Carolina and in West Virginia and in Kentucky, 600 acres up to 12,000 acres would be granted to individual veterans of the war. This was in lieu of money because the state governments didn't have any money at the time.
You know, when I think of early exchange between mountain people and the federal government, I can't help but think of the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, a lot of folks who have heard of the stereotype, really, of the mountain moonshiner, a lot of these people feel that the whole inclination toward moonshining is overstated in the mountains, and of course it may have been. But the Whiskey Rebellion is a reality. Tell us about the Whiskey Rebellion. It existed, I understand, in Pennsylvania, but this was an early misunderstanding, clash between the federal government and mountain people.
That's right. We here in the South tend to think of the Appalachians as stopping at the Ohio River, and that just is not true. The farmers in remote areas, until fairly recently, found it difficult to ship grains of various kinds, corn and wheat, to market. Big bulk, poor roads, it just didn't work very well. And the most convenient way was to reduce these grains to whiskey of some kind and then sell the whiskey. The federal government in the 1790s put an excise tax on whiskey.
This is when George Washington was president.
That's right. That's right. This was President Washington. And the farmers in western Pennsylvania refused to pay the tax. They organized themselves into something of an army. And Washington reorganized the old Revolutionary Army with some volunteers and sent them out.
These were actually, though, outraged mountain moonshiners, you could say.
Well, what they were, and I think that is true, but what's important here is that they were outraged taxpayers. And the thing that bothered the mountain people was the tax. And that has been the problem all along. It's not that the government has, until the 1920s, was objecting to the making of the whiskey. That was not the problem. They could make the whiskey, but they didn't want to pay the tax on the whiskey.
At this time, indeed, you had a still as surely as you had a loom. I guess whiskey was considered a staple, and a part of being self-sufficient was to make your whiskey. And I guess it did hit these folks as ironic that they just fought a war over things like a tax on tea. Then all of a sudden, here's a beverage that they feel that's just as important, I guess, being taxed by the new government.
Although, if they made it and they consumed it themselves, they did not have to pay a tax.
I see. Only if they produced it to sell.
Right.
But that was a major cash crop.
Yes.
In the mountains at that time.
That's right.
It was marketable.
Well, it was the money that they used to pay their local taxes. And they needed that money to keep their land, which to them was the key to the prosperity of their family.
So federal troops actually marched westward from where? Harrisburg, Philadelphia?
From Philadelphia, because Philadelphia was the capital of the country.
And they crushed this rebellion of mountain farmers.
That's right.
Okay, did the mountain farmers settle back down and behave, or did a lot of them flee into more remote areas of the mountains?
What they did was they made their illegal moonshine much more quietly than they had done before.
But all of the stories about moonshining and the antipathy of mountain people for revenuers and the outright strife, much of this is historically based.
Yes, it is.
Okay, and it has existed from 1791, you say?
Yes, although for a lot of the 19th century there was no tax on whiskey. So that, but it dies off in the early 19th century and isn't revived again until after the Civil War.
From the time of the Revolutionary War to the time of the Civil War, would you say there was much federal government involvement at all in the Southern Mountains, either in helping or regulating or planning, or pretty much just the feds in Washington and the mountain people in their hollows, and the folks weren't really that keenly aware of each other?
There was relatively little relationship except for one thing, and that was that most of the mountain region waterways drain into the Mississippi River. And water transportation was by far the easiest form of transportation. So the people in the Southern Mountains tended to look for their financial well-being to New Orleans rather than to the eastern part of the United States. And New Orleans was at first controlled by a foreign nation. Then after the Louisiana Purchase, part of the Mississippi, at least one bank of the Mississippi, was still controlled by the Spanish. And the entire episode with Aaron Burr was over this thing here. And we know, for example, that John Sevier, who would become governor of Tennessee, was probably on the payroll of the Spanish government, and that the commander-in-chief of the American Army, a man by the name of James Wilkinson, was earning about $1,500 as commander-in-chief of the American Army and $3,000 as a spy for Spain.
I'll be right.
So that there was a feeling on the part of the people in this area that the federal government wasn't doing enough for them. It should secure the Mississippi River so that they would have a way to get their goods to the outside world.
So in spite of the fact that many Southern Mountain people supported the Revolution, they tended to be very patriotic. From the time of the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, they felt that all the federal government was interested in maybe is the northeastern seaboard or New England. They felt that they were orphans, stepchildren. And their attitude toward the federal government was rather mixed as to how enthusiastic they were for federal government.
Yes, at the same time, they were intensely patriotic about the country as a whole. And this would be an attitude that most Americans shared. This would be nothing unusual. Most Americans did not want the government involved in what they considered to be their private business. At the same time, Americans were becoming increasingly patriotic about the nation. So that there's kind of an ambivalent feeling.
Well, how much of this ambivalence is tied to the fact that Southern Mountain people really just wanted to be left alone? They valued independence household by household rather than nation by nation or state by state.
There's a great deal to that, but there's also something else that needs to be recognized here. Southern Mountain people, at least as far as my research goes back, and that goes back to the period of the Civil War, have always looked upon the federal government as an agency of economic development. That the federal government would somehow supply them with the wherewithal to develop their region because their state governments weren't doing it. It was an alternative source of capital and expertise and so on.
There has then been as much or more rapport with the federal government in a state, say, like Kentucky, as with the State House.
Yes, absolutely.
And that brings us very quickly to the Civil War because, as you indicated, mountain people felt the federal government was more into the development in Boston or New York or Philadelphia. But when the Civil War came, we found that thousands and thousands of Southern Mountain people preferred the Union or wanted to preserve the Union rather than getting involved with the Confederacy. So while there was not a great deal of allegiance to Washington, evidently there wasn't a great deal of allegiance to Frankfort or to Atlanta or to the other state houses of the South. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Although the people did have, as I indicated before, a strong patriotic feeling. Mm-hmm. They might not be attached to the federal government, but they were attached to the United States.
Right. But this really was more what you'd call patriotism based on culture and kind of in-group consciousness.
Absolutely.
And real resistance to any threat from without.
Yes.
Okay, because they didn't really feel they had a great deal of vested interest or even a great deal to gain out of the federal government, evidently.
No, although they hoped that they would.
Right. They hoped that Washington would do what Frankfort or, like I say, Atlanta or Nashville would not.
Right.
Okay? Well, from the time of the Civil War, and the Civil War was filled with trauma for the Southern Mountains, what was the government attitude toward the Southern Mountains? I'm talking about the federal government. Now, I've heard that Abraham Lincoln was appalled at not only the conditions that his troops found in the Southern Mountains, but he was pleased that a lot of Southern mountaineers were Unionists, and indeed that he said that something special should be done by the federal government for Southern Mountain people. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. One of his strategic objectives was to get a federal army into East Tennessee. And he kept pushing when his generals kept telling him, we can't go there. But I think there's an incident that took place during the war that describes the limits of federal intervention in this area. There was a Confederate army in East Tennessee, or actually two of them, and two federal armies. And the armies of that time period didn't bring their food with them. Mm-hmm. They ate what was available. Mm-hmm. And so the civilian population of East Tennessee began quite literally to starve to death. Hmm. The government provided no food at all. Instead, a Unionist by the name of Nathaniel Taylor went to the cities of the Northeast, kind of like the CARE organization, and begged literally for money and food and clothing, and raised about $150,000 and brought all of this back by private effort. Mm-hmm. And the federal government provided almost nothing, so that Lincoln, while interested in the people of the Southern Mountains, did not see the federal government involved in what we would consider to be a legitimate function of the federal mm-hmm. government today. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, what were the first programs of a developmental nature in the Southern Mountains? Do you have to come all the way to the period of the New Deal, or were there efforts after the Civil War to create some economic vitality in the region, or to rebuild parts of the region that had suffered from the war, at least?
There were some limited efforts. One of my favorite Republican congressmen from East Tennessee kept introducing bills to make Knoxville a port of entry, to have ships come all the way up the Mississippi and all throughout the Tennessee River and have a customs house at Knoxville. Mm-hmm. The same was true here in eastern Kentucky. One of the congressmen here tried to and succeeded in getting money in dredging the Big Sandy mm-hmm. and improving the navigation of the Big Sandy. There were special projects like that. Mm-hmm. But the program that promised to do the most, and unfortunately never passed, was the Blair Education Bill. And I refer to that because I'm writing a biography of Senator Blair right now, and I'm familiar with it. But he proposed to give federal aid to public education. And if this bill had passed, appropriations for public education in East Tennessee and eastern Kentucky would have increased 600%. Hmm. Now, if that had happened, some of the educational problems that these two states face today mm-hmm. might well have been solved very early in the educational process.
So mountain people felt that there was greater support for them at the federal level than at the state level, but it remained pretty much just in a positive attitude state.
That's right. That's exactly
and
right.
Maybe even that was accompanied by some benevolent but condescending attitudes.
Yes, although the people designating Appalachia as a unique region were novelists primarily in this early time period. And there were a lot of very well-informed people who just considered this to be part of the South.
I see.
And there were enough stereotypes associated with the South.
With the South in general, right?
Right, that you didn't need a separate mountain stereotype.
Let's jump very quickly to the New Deal, because we don't have a great deal of time. And most of us are aware, of course, of the Great Depression. And it was hard on the entire nation, but I guess it was particularly hard in the Southern Mountains. Of course, a lot of people would say that poverty can't get much worse, just another degree of poverty. But Southern Mountain people to this day are keenly aware of what the WPA, the CCC, what other programs did in the Southern Mountains, not only giving folks jobs, but in improving some of the facilities in the area and access to the area. Now, let me digress just for a second. We know that the Southern Mountain region became very much Republican in certain counties after the Civil War. Evidently then, Southern Mountain people supported Herbert Hoover and weren't particularly excited when FDR was elected president. Is that correct to say?
That is correct.
Okay. Did FDR and the engineers of the New Deal feel a particular interest in the Southern Mountains and its plight, or was there so much deprivation and chaos in the nation that the Southern Mountain region just kind of lined up with every other part of the country in that period of the 30s?
Now, the Southern Mountain region was recognized as special. The first major piece of welfare legislation of the New Deal was the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, of course, TVA does not involve just Appalachia, and there are many parts of Appalachia that aren't part of TVA. But most of the publicity that came out about TVA was centered in East Tennessee. And so there was a recognition that poverty in the mountain regions of the South was probably worse than any place else in the country.
Now, ironically, East Tennessee is that bastion of republicanism, and FDR had to know that. Was he hoping through TVA to at least pick up a few folks for the Democratic Party, or was that not even a conscious part of his agenda?
FDR was a very political person. But I think it is fair to say that politics was probably the least important element in his decision. Actually, TVA was the brainchild of Senator George Norris of Nebraska, and Senator Norris at this time was an independent. He belonged to neither political party, and so that TVA, originally at least, was one of the least political government programs that the federal government has come up with.
We're going to have to jump past the New Deal, which is a shame. We haven't even touched on all the programs, but I do want to ask you, in your opinion, did Senator Kennedy, to become President Kennedy, did he feel a special tie to the Southern Mountains or a special obligation to the Southern Mountains because of the plight of the mountains, or do you feel that the primary in West Virginia that supposedly was critical to him was a major factor in his decision to design programs, or to begin designing programs that were subsequently filled out by the Johnson administration? Was that repaying the area politically, or did he really have a burden for the Southern Mountains?
He had chosen West Virginia very carefully. Most political commentators didn't realize that when Al Smith, who was Catholic, was nominated for president in 1928, he had chosen West Virginia as a southern state to demonstrate that he could win Protestant votes. And he carried West Virginia in 1928. So that when Kennedy came to West Virginia in 1960, he and his advisors had remembered something that everyone else had forgotten. That 32 years earlier, when being a Catholic was a greater burden, that Al Smith had carried West Virginia. So Kennedy had made a very shrewd political decision. He expected to carry West Virginia, and he owed the state nothing. Kennedy was genuinely shocked by what he saw in West Virginia. He knew of mountain poverty, but it's one thing to know about it intellectually, and it's something else to see it firsthand. And so the program that eventually became the War on Poverty came out of his experience here.
Right.
Now again, President Kennedy was a very political person.
Probably couldn't separate out altruism and political ambition if he wanted to.
That's right. But I think it's clear that in this particular case, he did not feel that he owed to West Virginia politicians, for example, a debt, and this was just repayment on a debt. He fully intended and expected to win in West Virginia.
We're going to have to start wrapping it up, but there are two key questions to me. Today, what do you feel the general attitude of Southern Mountain people is toward the federal government? Are they still hopeful that the federal government will do something miraculous in the area? Or do they feel they're beyond the need for that? What is the mountain attitude toward the federal government? One of tolerance, one of enthusiasm, or one of outright resentment?
I think the attitude, like almost all attitudes, is very complex. The mountain people, like most Americans, have come to expect certain things of their government. And they feel that, I think in a real sense, that the government should provide a certain underpinning. Now, whether that is just a policy that provides for economic prosperity or certain welfare programs, it depends on the individual. But I think that it's important to note that while mountain people are very fiercely independent, they don't want anyone to tell them what to do, that they still expect the federal government to provide certain services. And they are very upset when those services are not provided. So it's a combination of, you leave me alone, but I want you to continue giving me whatever this is that I think I should have.
This has really been a fascinating discussion for me. I wish we could go on. We've hardly touched on many federal programs that would be of interest to our viewing audience. We are going to have to thank you, though, Dr. McKinney, and wrap this up and invite our friends to tune in again next week as we see another interesting aspect of our mountain heritage, our mountain life. Thank you, Dr. McKinney, and come back and let's take up these topics where we left them off.
Thank you, Phil.